As John mentioned, the automotive industry is facing significant challenges today, particularly given the rapid technological innovation that we're seeing in the sector. And historically, the sector has had to deal with issues such as where we are in the cycle. Is there an ongoing trade war? Where is the price of steel? What are my competitors doing? How do I expand globally? And not only does the industry today need to deal with those ongoing challenges, but now they need to deal with several new technology challenges, such as what is going to be the pace of electric vehicle adoption? How much do I need to invest in autonomous vehicles and connected vehicles, and when will they get here? What are some of the new technology entrants like Waymo, Tesla, and others doing in the industry today? It's interesting, 10 years ago, Waymo, Tesla, Uber, Lyft, they were barely on anybody's map. Now Uber's trying to raise an IPO at a valuation north of $100 billion, which is more than Ford and GM combined. And so the industry is facing a lot of challenges, and luckily today we have a great panel here to help share their insight on some of the key trends that the industry is facing, as well as advice for companies and private equity and other investors on what they should be doing to address these trends. I'll introduce the panel. All the way to the farthest is Bob Nardelli. Bob was the former CEO of Home Depot and Chrysler. He is currently the founder and chairman of Accelerate. Next to Bob is Pin Ni. Pin Ni is the president of Wansheng International. Wansheng is one of the largest automotive parts companies in China. They have invested in companies such as Karma, which is a former Fisker, as well as A123. Next to Pin is Julia Steyn. Julia helped found Maven, which is a car sharing service within GM. She ran that for a few years and recently left there and joined the board at First Group. And then finally, we have Fritz Henderson. Fritz is the former CEO of GM, of Suncoke, which is a supplier of steel to the automotive industry, and he's currently the non-executive chairman at Adient. So thank you for this panel for joining us today. The first question I would like to maybe start off with both Bob and Fritz. And so, the industry, as we talked about, is facing a lot of challenges today. We also went through a lot of challenges in 2008 and 2009, which was for different reasons. But can you talk about some of the lessons that you guys have learned through all the variety of challenges that the industry has faced over the years and how they're applicable for today? So, Bob, why don't we start with you?
Thanks, Tom. So certainly, if you flash back to 7, 8, and 9, I was with Cerberus Capital Management, and we purchased Chrysler from Daimler. And the first challenge was to stand up a 125-year-old company to all the verticals that you would think of: finance, legal, etc. And we purchased it in the middle of 07. And we had a great stub period. And we ended 07 with about $9 billion in cash, and we're feeling pretty good about ourselves. And then it started to get a little frothy out there, and we started to figure out we better look at some cost reduction. We better look at some conservation of cash, etc. Probably one of the biggest mistakes we made, Tom, was at the end of 07, we released $3 billion. And the old adage, cash is king? Well, that's probably something we forgot as we headed into the downturn. Fritz will have a number too, but we were burning about $1 billion a month. And the focus then was, how do we conserve cash? How do we stay alive to fight another day? I think if you fast forward, all the things you talked about, the challenges facing the automotive industry today, or the mobility industry, however you want to identify it, have a number of items that they got to think about. The autonomous, they got to think about EV, they got to think about fuel cell, they got to think about a variety of propulsion methodology. In addition to that, they got to think about who's going to disintermediate the traditional OEM business through Lyft, through Uber, etc. So while we felt we had our hands full and challenged in 7, 8, and 9, as the financial market melted down, you know, many of our customers couldn't meet the FICO score of 750. They didn't have the ability to put $5,000 on the hood. We were no longer allowed to lease a vehicle. So it was a matter of survival then. Now it's all about technology, and where change will be the only constant, Tom.
Fritz, what would you like to add?
What I would say, our number was $2 billion a month. That was our burn. And what I would say is the 08 and 09 period was a period where we dealt with the legacies of the past. What the management teams are facing today are choices about the investments for the future. It's two fundamentally different sets of circumstances. What was done in 08 and 09 and then subsequent through 2009 positioned the companies, whether it was fixing the fixed cost structure, getting the capital structure right, allocating capital more efficiently, exiting markets that were unprofitable. A lot of it was positioning the companies. So if you look at a General Motors or a Ford or the C part of FCA, just significantly profitable companies that are generating a lot of cash flow, and they're facing choices about where they allocate capital. How do you invest in alternative propulsion, EV? Where do you play in ride share or shared mobility? Interestingly, my experience with that is historically the automakers don't necessarily play very well as they move downstream toward the customer. And then lastly, and probably the most interesting and the most challenging technically, is how do you play on autonomous? Good news is they have more than adequate resources to be able to make those choices. And you know, how do you actually bridge these two periods? The need for thoughtful but urgent action actually is how I would bridge them. Because you're making two different sets of choices, you know, whether you're addressing the challenges in 08 or 09, or you're thinking about these investments in the future. Commit. I think it's just important to commit. Understand that the actions you're taking now, you may not see that in the market 6, 7, or 8 years from now, but you got to make those choices, you got to make those investments now, or you're going to be behind.
Good. You know, one of the key trends that you mentioned, Fritz, is you know, really Uber and Lyft, and particularly the younger generation, the millennials and Generation Z. They're buying a lot less cars. They're not owning cars. They're using cars, or they're sharing cars. And you know, Julia, you spent a lot of time thinking about this at GM, and particularly with Maven, which is one of the things that GM committed to try to address this and the whole car sharing platform. Can you talk about how you guys view the car sharing world, how you decided, you know, how GM decided to start Maven to address that, and what some other things people are doing out there to address this whole new car sharing landscape?
Well, from the customer standpoint, there are massive shifts. Some of them are social and economic shifts because, again, a lot of millennials, they do live in the urban environments, and owning a car in the urban environment has really started to be prohibitive. And so there's just that part of the consumer mentality. And then another part of it is fundamentally what Uber and Lyft did so successfully is complete system redesign, because cabs existed before, but what they did, they specifically designed a product that fits into consumer lifestyle. So you don't have to hail a cab, you just know exactly when the car is showing up. So the shift that is happening in the consumer minds is obviously the mobility and the phone. It's all linked together. Everything needs to be on demand. And again, another shift is away from the car ownership. So what that means, I think the first sort of parts of the business that are seeing this technological disruption is the OEMs. But unfortunately, I think the whole value chain, OEM's also a very small part of the value chain when you look at the car altogether. It's all going to be affected, from leasing, from kind of how you service this, because again, the usage that the consumers want to use the car for potentially is moving away from a personal use to some kind of the gig economy use. And again, people stop caring about the brand so much, but as the utility and ability to access it. So this is just bringing it how the OEMs think about it. it's a big challenge because skill set wise, the automotive industry for years is built around the skill set that designs, manufactures, and distributes the vehicle. And all of a sudden, you need to start considering new business models that are not within sort of the scope of the responsibilities that a lot of the teams internally have.
And then Penn, one of the other mega trends is the change of the propulsion system, moving away from internal combustion engines to either hybrids or pure electric vehicles. You own both an electric vehicle company as well as a battery company. Can you talk about how you see that trend playing out over the next few years?
Sure. So, I was Fritz was just telling me that the biggest mistake we probably made in the United States is to buy the Fisker. So obviously we bought the A123 as well, which is another challenge. So from what we can see, that the electrical vehicle fundamentally is no different than the combustion engine vehicle. I'm just making that statement. Compared to what we're talking about, autonomous driving and others and so forth and so on. So basically, you're talking about a hardware change. You take out of the combustion engine, put into the battery. So that's about it. So now the question is that better? Is that feasible? Or can that really survive? So in the long term, we still believe that's the case. But short term, as of today, I will be honest, that it is very challenging because just on the battery side, the technology is not there yet, and we don't have high enough density, we don't have low enough cost, we don't have many cycle life that needed for the auto industry, for the typical car. So there's still a long way to go. In fact, I always say this industry is kind of interesting. It's a commodity nature because all the OEM want to make you as a commodity supplier because they want to standardize the battery cell, but it has a high-tech feature because every 6 months, every year, you're going to see very quickly the cost change in the manufacturing process as well as the chemistry. So this is a pretty scary industry. So going forward, looking at in the big picture, I would say we see more. The survive for the electrical vehicle is moving into the autonomous driving space because there's a natural fit because of the electricity consumption. So electrical vehicle can support that. So now when you go into the autonomous driving, all of a sudden the situation is completely different because now you're talking about software replace the hardware instead of one hardware replace another hardware. So that is obviously even more scary in terms of what could happen. The one number I saw is that today the vehicle has 80% hardware, the rest is software. By 2030, the hardware will go down to about 40%. The rest is the content or the software. So the industry is going to be completely different.
And so Fritz and Bob, going back to you, given all the battles you've been in through for the industry, when you look at the proliferation of electric vehicles, software, ride sharing, what advice would you give to automotive companies on how to deal with this, as well as addressing the myriad of other challenges the industry typically faces?
Well, I'm going to pick up where Fritz left off. I think, as he so accurately said, we were dealing with the legacy. And what I've seen is, we had to take 35,000 families and furlough them. We took $5 billion of cost out. We sold $1 billion of non-earning assets. We really worked very hard to get the incentives down, to get the price and everything. And what's happened between 2009 and relatively now is that a lot of those bad practices, Fritz, I think you would say, have kind of crept back in again, where a lot of the OEMs were more focused on volume versus profitability. I think Mary's done a really nice job at GM trying to bring some of that back to life, and certainly she's raised the bar on quality, with the ignition switch. I think that Fritz also said very accurately, I would agree, is it's all about forward looking, and we've got to make sure that the legacy thinking that exist in a lot of the big OEMs around the world don't get in the way with the rate of change. I mean, change is the only constant, and the rate of change is 10x of what it used to be back in 7, 8, and 9, where we thought about, you know, a new platform, maybe 2 modifications, a new platform every 5 to 8 years. The consumer today isn't going to settle for that. And they're going to have to be extremely keen. I think, Pin, you're right, is you know, the technology, particularly the software in the platform going forward, is going to have such a level of sophistication versus what the mechanical drives did in those earlier days, Tom. So I just think it's going to take a major transformation, cultural change, if they really want to be competitive on a global basis.
I agree with that. What I would say, actually, I tried my whole career to not provide advice to my successors. And I guess through indirectly, I run that risk here this afternoon, but I'll just make a couple points. One, you know, they come to all OEMs today, they're going to need to invest in electric vehicles. It is, as Penn accurately said, it's changing a propulsion system, but it's still a vehicle. And so they're going to be engineering internal combustion engines and internal combustion engine vehicles for at least decades. You know, so they're going to be making the investments. They're going to be picking and choosing, trying to find ways to rationalize that investment because they're going to want to allocate capital to electric vehicle and alternative propulsion, and they have to do that. Fortunately, the level of profitability in the industry supports it if the companies are well run. So they'll be able to do that. They have to do that. Second is, I think with respect to GM setting up a separate subsidiary to deal with their investment in Lyft. I mean, I've been down the path of owning rental car companies. I've been down the path of owning dealerships, right? At least my former employer didn't necessarily do that well, right? We didn't think about dealing with the retail customer. That was not what we did well. And I think they made a good investment in Lyft, and it's worked out well. But, you know, they just need to be cautious about focusing in areas where they may not necessarily have the expertise. The issue of autonomous actually gets to a point that Julia made. I think the biggest risk faced by the automakers today is the risk of commoditization of the vehicle and of transportation. If you think about the pockets of profitability in the automotive industry, set aside financing for a minute, it's basically global premium, where someone will pay $100,000 for a car that somebody else is selling for $60,000 because of the brand. It's the US market, where the average transaction prices have crept towards, in some cases, $50,000 a vehicle. On average, I think it's still $40,000 a vehicle, but when I was there 10 years ago, it was $25,000 a vehicle. So transaction prices have risen significantly. And third, China, which has been a source of substantial profitability. Those are the engines of profit. There are other pockets, but those are the engines of profitability. If you think about transportation as a service and the commoditization of the vehicle, what is the point of a brand? What is the value of, how are you going to sell a $48,000 vehicle that's going to be a RoboCab?
Can I build on that for
And
a second?
I'll just finish. And so I think my advice is don't be a fast follower. Be part of how the industry evolves, because you're going to have to understand what your profit engine is in that world. And it's not altogether clear to me what that's going to be. So I think the risk of being a fast follower is high, and I think if I were given advice, it was be out there trying to understand what your position is going to be and what your profit model is going to be 10 years, 15 years from now.
I just was going to build upon your point about sort of what happens to the brands, and this is a very existential question. Do you just become a hardware provider, even if it has a lot of software in it? It's different capability, but it's still a thing. Or do you transact with the customer? And right now, if you run a service, we at Maven, we launched a brand that was specifically consumer focused and very much not hardware focused and not connected to any car. And when you start asking people what car do they drive, the majority of them basically said, I don't know, it was an SUV. So it's the utility. And another angle of it, which is, again, I think very important for the industry to look at right now, When Amazon announces that everything will be delivered within one day in the United States for the Prime membership, think about the organized fleets of cars that need to be run. Think about basically when you look at the growth of Uber and Lyft to achieve the numbers that they're talking about. It needs to be, they might not be owned by the same people, but it's still the coherent fleets that need to be run. So industry is moving a lot in that direction, and there's not a lot of infrastructure right now that can support that growth. So the growth is, I think, the biggest challenge that I see.
You know, Fritz, you mentioned China is one of the big profit areas in the current automotive landscape. We're kind of approaching a lot of the trends here today from a U.S. perspective. You know, right now China is the largest automotive market in the world and will probably be so for, the foreseeable future. China's facing a lot of the same challenges in its automotive landscape without probably a lot of the legacy of the past associated with it. Can you talk about how Chinese companies are approaching these issues in maybe a different manner than the U.S.?
Yeah, so China is very interesting, obviously. When I left China when we started business here in 1994, that was the same year GM went to China, the same year. And at that time, everything, is about the USA. If you want to be in the auto industry, if you want to be a global company, you have to come to the United States. Now it looks like it's a little opposite. But I would say, China, Tom, you're right. It's about a legacy issue as well as there's few pieces, make China a very different market. One is obviously the government influence, the effectiveness of the government policy. That is obviously very different. Secondly, I would say this is a structural issue from the legacy point of view. And when you don't really have all those legacy there, then you have, we call there's no back, so you can move much faster, much quicker, much more flexible, which shows in this electrical vehicle space. Everybody say, hey, if we want to try to get ahead of the game, we can bypass, let's just go directly to the electrical vehicle. So there's a lot of people thinking that way, believe that way. If you talk about the one Tesla here, we were joking the other day, if you look at the electrical vehicle, how many of them in the United States? Okay, you have a Tesla, now Rivian's coming out, and you still have a Fisker now called Karma, But in China, you probably can point at least 50 of them. And whether this is owned by Chinese people or owned by X BMW, X Daimler, there's quite a few of them. So everybody's thinking, moving in that direction is much faster, much easier. And then the third one, I would say in China, one of the difference, at least it's a culture, I would say. I was talking with Fritz as well. I said Chinese people are more gambling people. And this is coming from the last 40 years of China's economic reform. I was joking, the reform is all about push the envelope, try something that may not necessarily be legal today, but it will be legal tomorrow. So you don't know whether it's illegal tomorrow or not, but so you're going to give it a try. So the Chinese people are very much willing to try something new and take the risk. So that you can clearly see, in the AI space, in the autonomous driving, there's tons of people are involved. In fact, yesterday when I was in Chicago, we got on a phone call and with the neural computing for the autonomous driving team. At the end, all the pictures showed is all Chinese. So we said, what's going on here? It's all. So anyway, so there's a lot of those kind of mindset behind it in terms of, we're not afraid of failure. Let's give it a try. Let's gamble. If it works, that's great. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So it is a very different environment there.
Well, we're already receiving some questions from the audience, and so I'm going to open the session now up to questions from the audience. And the first one, maybe best for Fritz and Bob to go with, is which automaker do you feel is adapting quicker to the current environment? Like, who do you feel is making the right decisions? And I'll open it up to the audience. I figure Bob and Fritz, given your background, you might have some insight, maybe a little hesitant to...
I'll let Bob go first, actually, on this one.
Clearly GM, right?
I would say not comma, for sure.
Well, I think that, again, depending on, if you think about Tesla, certainly they're leading the way with electric vehicle. And not only in shape, function, but in technology. And a lot of it is in, again, is in the software. The level of intelligence in that vehicle versus more of a traditional, I think, is significantly different. If you think about who's reshaping the organization, back to the point Fritz made, I would say GM certainly is doing that, Ford is doing that. I mean, a lot of them are moving away from the traditional sedan and not only reshaping the structure, the culture, but the portfolio, I think getting a little more lean, a little more focused. The only risk of that, Tom, in my opinion, is, we're enjoying in the United States tremendous stability in fuel prices. And my limited experience, Fritz would have a lot more than me, is, when fuel is down, cars are big. People are going after trucks. Certainly Ford in the F-150 is dominant. If you think about, Silverado and then the Ram 1500, if you think about the SUVs, the only concern I've got is if in the future that would flip, either the car park will continue to get older, the current installed base of internal combustion engines will get bigger. So I think, they probably need to look towards a longer range than just the short range to be well positioned.
I'd bifurcate the question between alternative propulsion and self-driving and try to address each of those two. On alternative propulsion, on electrics, no question Tesla. They've been out in the market, right? You're only now seeing in 19, you're going to see a premium Audi, you do have a premium Jaguar on the market. But Tesla's been well out ahead of everybody else on pure electrics. The unabashed and uncontested leader in hybrids has been Toyota. And interestingly, I've watched Toyota and Honda and Nissan and Hyundai, formidable companies. And you could just tell I can't see inside the company, but how they're responding to electrics has been, to me, interesting, because Toyota had decades of head start when it came to hybrids from the Prius, and they haven't necessarily capitalized on it. That doesn't mean they're not doing something. It just means that I just don't have insight into what's going on there. And I think people are basically going to chase Tesla on electrics. And so that's how I look at that. On autonomous, it's really, at this point, engineering and technology. And obviously you have other entrants like Waymo, lots of other potential players in this market that could change it at the risk of commoditization, my point earlier. But I think GM has done a good job in this area. Obviously Honda's decided they've done a good job and they've made an investment alongside. You're going to see, I think, partnerships in this area because the amount of the engineering challenge about doing a truly safe autonomous vehicle is considerable, right? And so I think that, and then I look into Europe and I see what the premium players are doing, and again, I don't have as good an insight into that. Maybe it's kind of a U.S.-centric view of the world in terms of what's happening on autonomous, but I do think General Motors has actually done a good job in this area, but I think there's a lot of chapters yet to be written in this, and so you might find these are formidable companies that I just whether it's a Daimler, whether it's a BMW, whether it's a Toyota, these are very formidable companies that have more than enough capability to develop great vehicles in the future, and so you need to be paranoid about where they are too.
Yep. And I think to that point, and Julia, this next question from the audience I think would be best directed to you. In my conversations with automotive executives, they're scared to death that they're going to be the cell phone industry from 20 years ago, where you see companies like Motorola, Nokia, Ericsson that just had their lunch eaten by Apple and to a certain extent Google coming in. We are starting to see some of the same names coming into the automotive industry. Companies like Google with Waymo, Apple's been flirting into it, Amazon's starting to make investment and is going to be a big player in kind of the logistics space, Julia, that you mentioned. How should the OEMs compete against these new technology entrants, particularly on certain battlefields where the technology companies might have advantages, such as software or developing networks like you were trying to do with Maven. So how do you think the automakers should respond to these new entrants?
I think it's an absolutely fascinating question, and very important one, because people in mobility space now coming at it from two different angles. The traditional Detroit or the German manufacturers come from engineering and manufacturing angle, and the Silicon Valley entrants came from system redesign and the consumer-centric purpose-built apps. What is happening right now, and I think autonomous is really, really in the crossroads of that, is I firmly believe that there will be no mobility company that doesn't have hard assets. And it's, by the way, a very difficult skill to be running a software company and then all of a sudden manage a huge balance sheet of assets. That's a skill that is required. And on the flip side, again, being an engineering house and managing a customer forward transacting business, that's also not within the skill sets. So right now, this is a very interesting time when two of these things are coinciding, and there will be, again, either partnerships or, again, in the case of autonomous, I think you're going to have to figure out how to run something that gets into consumer hands. So this requires a different skill set. Some of it will be, I think, in the partnership level, very regional businesses, because, again, the technological standards are vastly different that we have in the US, we have in China, and what Europe is developing. So the good news, I don't think it's been answered yet, but this is the opportunity that the industry is facing.
I'd add one thing, Tom.
Absolutely, go.
I mean, if you look at what Geely's done with Volvo, it's quite impressive what they've done. Not only from a business standpoint, growing the brand and rebuilding the brand, but its application of electric in EV. I mean, so I don't think it'd be fair to let the comment pass without they've really done a very fine. There's probably 50 different electric vehicle companies in China, as Pin said, but the one that's really done an outstanding job has been Geely and Volvo. They've just been great.
And I think that's a good segue to the next question. One of the questions from the audience, a threat to the industry that we haven't discussed yet is China, and particularly Chinese companies coming to the US. You go back to the 1960s and the big three dominated the automotive market, and then the Japanese showed up. And China is trying to become more of a global player and ultimately come to the US. Pin, how do you see that playing out, and who do you view as some of the companies in China more likely to be successful globally, and particularly in the US?
So I would say, whatever happened in the 60s, 70s, I would say it's fundamentally different today. So on one side, obviously, the world is much more in terms of global market, is much more, consolidated. So you would say the advantage you had back in the 60s, 70s to, coming from another country to the United States to build a new plant, you have very different approach, you have a different cost structure, and so forth and so on. Those are probably gone. And, I'm also I'm also the chairman of a China General Chamber of Commerce in the Midwest. We see many Chinese companies coming here trying to start the business like their American, competitors. But most of them honestly failed. The failure is due to, their cost structure. I just be very simple, I always use that example. If I want to hire a guy from GM, if I'm the Chinese company and they say, what's your name? I say, it's Wan Shang. How spell? Oh no, it's a waxing or whatever. So, so they say, okay, I'm fine with GM, and I've been with GM for 20 years. I got a good pension and so forth and so on. So what do you want to offer me? So I say, okay, I offer you, one time. I say, no, it's not worth it. And so, okay, how about 2 times? So at the end, you can build another GM in the United States, but your cost is going to be 2 times higher than GM itself. So that would never work. So to me, I like what Julia was talking about. To me, I see more and more, if you want to see really effective approach, is combining companies. So like, Geely did it with Volvo, same thing. So if one day some Chinese company come in here, they can start to build a greenfield operation, build a new plant, so forth and so on, but I don't see that is going to happen. At least I don't feel that's going to be successful, because they're going to have the same union issue. I mean, they're going to just pay more, that's all. So if they can team together with their US partners, then it will be a lot different. But we don't see that right now at this moment. Although the Chinese law required the foreign company going to China, you have to have 50-50. Coming back here, probably we will say, hey, we don't want you to come to our space. We have to, give you 50 neither. So we haven't seen that yet. We see GAC announced many times they want to be in the United States. I remember 2011 when the president of China came to visit us, he wanted us to organize an event. So we invited BYD to come. BYD brought the vehicle called E6, I think. They claim Warren Buffett drove that car. That's a pure electrical vehicle. That was 2011, But nothing really, there's a lot of talking, but nothing really, at the end stick. So I would say, unless we will see those kind of global combination happens, then this is going to be very effective. Otherwise, I would say, they're going to come here, but they're not going to be a bigger player like a Toyota. That's my view.
Bob, here's a question I have for you. I'm gonna turn the tables a little bit, which is a lot of these new mobility technology companies, whether it's Uber, Lyft, Tesla, you name it, they are very good at raising money at very high valuations, but maybe other than a quarter for Tesla, they haven't demonstrated an ability to be anywhere close to profitability. And the automotive industry is a very tough and cutthroat industry, as everybody on this panel knows from having lived in it for however many years. What do you think are going to be the critical factors for Uber, Lyft, Tesla, pick any of those names, to get to longer term profitability?
Well, I think, we talked a little bit about Tesla, and they've been out there for a while, and they have not been profitable until recently. We've seen a lot of very deliberate action on the part of Musk relative to shutting down some of the showrooms, leaning out the organization. I think one of the biggest challenges he still has is, if what is being publicized that he's at about $140 to $150 per kW, Tom, or whether it's really $240. Is the real issue relative to profitability. So I think they still are trying to schedule some inventions to get the affordability or the cost down on that. I'm a little surprised that they've kind of lost first mover advantage relative to EV, and so that's going to have to change. I think Fritz's point relative to, you got some of these monsters coming out now that do have the brand, that do have the dealer distribution, that do have a whole host of very competent engineers. In fact, the thought was that Tesla would create the market, and right or wrong, they would be fast followers. I think they may have a little bit of an edge now on the lead, Tom. So I think that's one thing that's going to have to happen is who's going to be out there with the best credentials and the best performance, and the dealer network for services. It's one thing to be able to, go to a handful of people and change their battery out. When you get, the volumes that, for example, GM has, that's going to be very difficult.
Next question I'll address to both Pin and Fritz, since you guys either own or sit on the board of several Tier 1 or Tier 2 automotive parts suppliers. So given all the changes in the landscape that we're talking about and how the OEMs are changing their strategy and their investment approach, How is that going to change the interaction between the car maker and the tier 1 or tier 2 part supplier going forward? What support are they going to look for from those companies as opposed to just cutting prices further to help fund their share of the development?
Well, I'll start then, since Pin and I were actually handing it off here. I would say, Adient, we're the largest, we and Lear really are the two largest global automotive seat suppliers. And we supply virtually every OEM. Our share is 45% in China, it's 35% globally. So we supply everybody. And the good news is all those vehicles have seats, whether they're electric vehicles, whether they're autonomous vehicles, they have seats. They're potentially different. You know, the configurability of an autonomous vehicle, the interior and the seats and the functionality. I mean, we are spending time and engineering money actually working on that. How it changes the relationship with the OEM? First of all, the relationships with the OEMs differ by OEM. Because OEMs have different strategies. You know, whether you deal with a Toyota, you deal with a General Motors, you deal with a Volkswagen. All those companies have different strategies for how they develop and engineer, and then they rely on their suppliers. So, you know, I start off with not every customer they're not ubiquitous, they're different. They could evolve. In some cases, they ask for more support. In some cases, they ask for less, and even that evolves by customers. So, I don't. Certainly, in the case of seats, which is what I can speak to most directly, I don't see it changing a lot. Other than when we start reconfiguring interiors, then I think there's going to be a lot more interplay between the supplier and the OEM when it comes to an interior of a vehicle that's going to be much more configurable. Okay.
So our experience is a little different. So I'm just talking from the battery side as an example. We do see the OEM, the tier 1, are fighting for who owns the core technology. Or the OEM want to own the core technology, make the product as a commodity as much as they could. BMW did a very good job to make the battery cell into, they call VDA cell, which is a standardized, the same size, same format, everything's the same, so they can take that to many, many different battery company and for price competition. However, on the other side, you know, like I can use A123 example. We try to hold very tight to the BMS system. And because the BMS is the way that we believe that can really have a whole lot of value added, a lot of software in there, a lot of new technology can incorporate. However, I would say we're losing the battle at the end because OEM is the customer. So at the beginning, I just give you an example. At the beginning, you know, A123 had a joint venture with SAIC, which is the largest auto company in China. And SAIC didn't have the BMS, you know, technology or capability, so they need a joint venture with A123. And little by little, you know, SAIC developed its own technology, and then they view this as their future engine. They say, we're not going to give you the BMS anymore. As far as you can go, we allow you to do the pack. So you have to stop at the pack, and the BMS on is all the OEM responsibility. We see more and more those kind of OEMs in China, at least, are pushing for that as well. Originally, they had no clue. They're okay for you to take over everything as long as you give them a solution. They're very happy. So we're talking about solution, you know, with both of us, you know, yes. for the stop-start, you know, system as well. But then we see, as soon as getting to the volume, getting to be more mature, the OEM would like to take it inside because they view this as a strategic components that they want to have a control. So this battle will keep going on and on and on. I would say, you know, it will never stop, but it's just a matter of who can have a better, have a better resources, or who will be the first one can give a, put into the market.
Thank you. We have a little over a minute left, and I apologize we're not able to get to all the questions from the audience, but this last question, I'm going to actually ask it to each of the four members of the panel, and it's a little fun, but what is your favorite car ever? So, Bob, why don't we start with you?
Well, let's see, I drive Ram 1500.
There you go. Okay. Loyal man.
Does bicycle count?
You can say karma.
No, I always drive Ford. And, you know, Ford is, I mean, we bought a few plants from Ford. And so they are, you know, a major customer, so I always drive Ford. And I just view car as transportation. I don't wash the car even, you know. I just say, forget about it. I don't serve the car should serve me, so anyway.
Mine might be a scooter in the near future, but
That's
I'm an
even
Aston
better.
Martin girl. Sorry, the James Bond references.
Corvette. Corvette.
It's a perfect answer.
No question.
There you go. Well, thank you to each of our panel members here for their time, and thank you, audience, for your participation as well. Thank you.
Yeah.